March 24, 1971, at a trade fair in Sao Paulo, Volkswagen unveiled a car nobody expected from the maker of the humble, air-cooled Beetle. Records show more than 10,000 of these coupes would eventually leave the factory, built on real engineering ambition, not a borrowed shell dressed up for looks. This was the SP2, and for a few short years it stood among the most beautiful cars Volkswagen ever produced. Then Volkswagen itself ended it. No rival forced the decision, no scandal buried it. Tell us below, which discontinued car do you still wish you could buy today? Brazil in the late 1960s was closed to the outside world, at least on the roads. Government policy banned foreign car imports outright, protecting local factories but leaving buyers with almost no choice. Sedans, trucks, and family cars filled the market. A genuine sports car did not exist, not from Volkswagen, not from anyone building at scale. Inside Volkswagen's Brazilian operation, that gap looked less like a problem and more like an opening. Unlike most subsidiaries, VW do Brasil answered to Wolfsburg only loosely. Decisions that would have taken years in Germany could happen in months in Sao Paulo. Rudolf Leiting, running the Brazilian arm before later leading the entire company, wanted to use that freedom for something bold. Records point to 1969 as the starting line. A small internal team, led by an engineer named Schiemann, began sketching a car under the codename Project X. Nothing about the assignment was modest. Leiting wanted a genuine two-seat sports coupe styled in-house, built from parts Volkswagen already had sitting in its own warehouses. That last detail mattered more than it first appears. A new sports car from scratch meant new tooling, new suppliers, and costs no regional subsidiary could justify alone. So the team reached for what already worked. The floor pan came from the Type 3 platform. The engine came straight out of the Beetle's own lineup. Ambition and budget discipline, running side by side. By 1971, that plan reached the public. A prototype debuted at a Sao Paulo trade fair, and the reaction was immediate. Here was a car that looked nothing like anything Volkswagen had built before. Low, sleek, almost Italian in its proportions. Crowds gathered around it in a way Beetles and Combis never managed. 18 months later, the finished version reached dealerships. Volkswagen called it the SP1, and on paper, expectations were high. Underneath the striking new body sat a 1.6-liter flat 4, producing just 65 horsepower, a number better suited to a family sedan than a sports coupe wearing that kind of shape. Reviewers noticed immediately. A car built to turn heads on a highway struggled to build real speed on one. 0 to 60 took longer than buyers expected from something that looked this fast standing still. Word spread quickly through Brazil's small enthusiast circles, and it was not the word Volkswagen had hoped for. Only 88 SP1 units left the factory before Volkswagen quietly pulled it from sale. Weeks, not years, decided its fate. For a company that had just proven it could design something genuinely striking, that outcome stung. The shape had done its job. The engine had not done its job. What happened next inside Volkswagen do Brasil wasn't retreat. Leiting's team went back to the drawing board with one clear target: fix the power problem before the public lost interest entirely. Nobody involved yet understood how close that second attempt would come to getting it right, or how far short it would ultimately still fall. 8 months after the SP1 disappeared, Volkswagen tried again. The SP2 arrived in 1973 with a larger 1.7-liter engine, updated badging, and a promise that this version would finally match its own shape. 75 horsepower replaced 65, a modest jump on paper, but one Volkswagen hoped would be enough. Inside the cabin, the changes went further than the engine bay. Designers Marcio Piancastelli, José Vicente Martins, and Jorge Oba had built something genuinely ahead of its moment. A driver-focused dashboard, gauges angled toward the seat, switchgear grouped by function instead of scattered across the panel. Sports cars twice its price rarely offered that level of thought. Outside, the shark-nosed profile drew comparisons to machines built in Stuttgart and Turin. Despite starting life on a Beetle's own floor pan, owners today still describe strangers stopping them at fuel stations, asking what the badge on the hood actually meant. In a market with almost no competition, the SP2 did not just fill a gap, it became the car enthusiasts in Sao Paulo actually wanted. A dedicated following grew fast. Clubs formed around it within a few short years, something no previous Volkswagen product built in Brazil had managed. If you're the kind of viewer who likes finding the story hiding behind a badge everyone recognizes, this channel digs one up every week, so consider subscribing before we go further. Here's where the story turns. 75 horsepower sounded like progress next to the SP165. Against the cars the SP2 was now being cross-shopped with, at home and occasionally abroad, that number still fell short. A claimed top speed near 100 miles an hour looked respectable in a brochure. On an actual road, next to an actual rival, it rarely held up. Motoring journalists in Brazil kept circling back to the same complaint. Beautiful shape, thoughtful cabin, genuine engineering care, undercut by an engine that never fully matched the ambition wrapped around it. One reviewer wrote that the SP2 looked like it was already going 80 while parked at a stoplight, a compliment aimed squarely at what the car couldn't quite deliver once the light turned green. Export attempts made the gap even harder to ignore. Of the roughly 10,000 SP2s eventually built, fewer than 700 ever left Brazil, and most of those went to markets with little appetite for a sports coupe that couldn't outrun the family sedans parked beside it. Volkswagen's own engineers were not blind to any of this. Internal proposals for a more powerful successor began circulating almost as soon as the SP2 reached showrooms, well before sales figures gave anyone reason to worry. That project would eventually carry a name of its own, and it would come agonizingly close to solving everything the SP1 and SP2 never quite fixed. For now, though, the SP2 kept selling. Brazil's enthusiasts had waited years for a homegrown sports car, and even an imperfect one beat none at all. What almost nobody outside Volkswagen's own boardrooms understood yet was how little time this quiet success actually had left. That successor had a name, the SP3. Engineers pulled a 1.8-liter water-cooled engine straight from the Brazilian Passat, tuned it with twin carburetors, and squeezed out roughly 100 horsepower, nearly a third more than the SP2 ever managed. On paper, this was the car the SP1 should have been from the very beginning. Prototypes ran well, internal testing showed real gains in acceleration, and for the first time, a Volkswagen do Brasil sports car could genuinely keep pace with its own looks. Engineers who worked on the project later described a real sense that they had finally closed the gap between the SP2's body and its heart. Then the ground shifted under the entire program, not because of anything the SP3 did wrong. Volkswagen's air-cooled platforms, the Beetle-derived bones underneath everything the SP line had ever built on, were approaching the end of their life across the company's global lineup. Tightening emissions rules in key markets made the older architecture increasingly difficult to justify. Wolfsburg's attention, and its money, moved toward water-cooled platforms built for a different future entirely. Picture the moment inside a Brazilian engineering office in early 1976. A finished proposal sits on a desk, backed by real testing data ready for approval. Somewhere in Wolfsburg, a decision is already being made that has nothing to do with how well that engine performs on a test track. The SP3 never gets built. Production of the SP2 itself stops the same February, after just over 10,000 cars. A workaround existed, briefly. An outside engineering firm developed an upfit kit, letting existing SP2 owners install the SP3's stronger engine themselves. Word never fully spread, and the price of the conversion sat far outside what most owners were willing to pay for a car they'd already accepted as underpowered. Few kits ever found their way into an actual SP2, and fewer still survive today with the swap intact, making a true fixed SP2 one of the rarest configurations in the entire model's short history. Here's the detail that makes this cancellation sting even more. That same year, 1976, Porsche launched its new 924, a shape that more than a few longtime SP2 owners recognized instantly. Long hood, sloped rear glass, a proportion Volkswagen's own designers had explored years earlier in Sao Paulo. Porsche never claimed direct inspiration, and no evidence ties the two projects together officially. Still, the resemblance became a quiet, bitter footnote among Brazilian enthusiasts who'd watched their own car die the very year a strikingly similar silhouette launched an ocean away. Volkswagen never framed the SP2's ending as a failure internally. Global platform strategy, not weak sales, closed the line. That distinction mattered little to the people who had waited years for a Brazilian sports car, saw it finally get fixed on paper, then watched Wolfsburg walk away before a single fixed unit reached a customer's driveway. The car hadn't let anyone down. The company simply stopped believing it was worth finishing. Somewhere in Brazil, a handful of SP2s still carry engines they were never supposed to get. Porsche's echo of that shape still runs the roads today, decades after the original was buried. Volkswagen has more forgotten cars like this one. Follow along, and we'll dig up the next.